with many specifying the US United States happen.
5, 4, 3.
On stage 2 engine ignition. 1 minute 25 seconds. Engine pressure hold. No
Chamber ready to rise.
291 4229.
Hey guys, City Walk, City Wall here, and welcome to Cities Skylines, Mars. This episode, we're going to start working in the actual city, in the lower half of the city. So this is going to be the slums of the city, like the beaten down people, the people who got tricked to come here thinking that they would have a better life on Mars. They're the ones who have no way to afford a trip back home. They're the people who run the colony. They do all the things that make it so that the people who live above them on like the really nice parts of the city don't have to think about any problems whatsoever. So that's what we're working on this episode. The first thing to consider is going to be the conveyor belt roads. And these are going to function as normal roads. They're going to be able to, let's say if someone dies, give a hearse access to the building to pick someone up, or if it's a commercial building, give a cargo truck, in this case a crate, access to the building in order to drop off the goods. So the way that I'm making these roads go through the streets of this lower part of the city is I'm using the Mars road that I created based off of the Nico OAS Invisible roads, and I'm using it pretty high up, like 14, 15 meters or something like that, but in the non-elevated version. So it's pulling up terrain, and I'm doing that in order to create zonable areas, and then I'm using the Ronix 69 terraforming network asset in order to hold that terrain back down to its original position. And basically what that does is it tricks the game into thinking that these roads, even though they're way up in the air, are actually ground roads and buildings have access to them. One of the issues with doing roads like this is that buildings, in order for them to actually think that they're connected to a road, the road needs to have a sidewalk attached to it. That's why in the game you can't zone highways, is because there's no sidewalk for pedestrians to walk on. So these conveyor belt roads, I had originally been trying to make them with no sidewalk, but I realized that makes it so that there's no zonable areas attached to them. And so these conveyor belt roads actually do have a sidewalk attached to them, and I don't want people walking up there. So the big struggle here was figuring out exactly how to make it so that citizens don't want to walk around up there, that they would prefer to walk around on pedestrian paths on the ground level. And I mentioned this in Kobayashi Island, that I'm pretty sure that there's a mechanic in the game where pedestrian paths are considered by citizens to be quicker, even if they are a longer distance. So underneath all of these conveyor belt roads on ground level, I'm going to be placing pedestrian paths, and probably even placing them down in a lot of places where there aren't even conveyor belt roads, so that it really allows citizens to get anywhere they want in the city on a pedestrian path, as opposed to them trying to take a car, like walk up to the conveyor belt and get in a car and drive there. That's obviously its own problem, is just like how many people I'm going to be seeing and things I'm going to be seeing that are like rising up and floating to the height of the conveyor belts. But that's just going to be one of the challenges of this series in general, is figuring out ways to continue having sidewalks on these conveyor belts so that the buildings get road access from them, but at the same time keeping citizens off the conveyor belts, because we don't want to see them walking around up there. So part of that is making sure that some of these buildings that I place a little bit further away from a conveyor belt do still have access to a road. And in order to do that, I think it's going to be different in every situation, but this episode, in order to do that, one of the things that I did was I made a junction in the road, in the conveyor belt, and had it go actually into a building and then do a little loop through a couple buildings and then come back and meet back up with the road again, so that inside some of the buildings, you know, where there's areas where these buildings might not actually have access to a road, it does still have access because there's a conveyor belt that goes in. And I think that actually looks pretty cool, seeing conveyor belts that go into buildings and things. And I'm imagining that we're going to be doing a good amount of that kind of stuff in other parts of the city as well. So, like I said earlier in the episode, these ground level areas are basically slums. They're kind of like the shops and walkways for the people who live in these apartments low down in the city. They're the people who kind of do all the work that is needed in order to actually run the colony efficiently and, you know, keep the life supports going and keep the water pumping and the electricity on. And these areas are, I'm guessing, not very well patrolled. They're not very safe. They're not very clean, and they're not very well maintained. So my thought is that they're going to be pretty gross looking down there. So I'm using a lot of corrugated metal props, like fences and buildings, and there's a great pack of sort of like shanty town corrugated metal residential buildings and commercial buildings, and all these things I'm going to be using down below, along with like decals that are, you know, very cracked and decayed concrete and wet concrete and slime and grungy things down there. And I also am placing down a ton of like market stalls and shops and little places for these people to like buy groceries and things, because I'm imagining that, you know, since this area down below, there's no roads like a conventional city, there's a lot more space like between the buildings. I wanted to give the buildings obviously a good amount of space between them, because you can't really see what's down there otherwise. Like, I wanted to be able to have like a good amount of room down there so that you could really look into these lower areas from above and see what was going on. If the buildings were too close, you couldn't do that. So that area kind of needs to be filled with stuff, and part of it's going to be filled with buildings, part of it's going to be filled with props, part of it's going to be filled with pipes and things like that. And it's going to be really fun going through and doing all of this, I think, because these areas, I don't want them to all look the same. I think it would be the coolest if each little area had its own thing going on. It wasn't just like the same kind of slums over and over. And I think a good example this episode of doing something like that is this really large building. I think it's some sort of like Chinese hotel asset maybe, but I'm using it as a residential building. And I put a corrugated fence around the whole front of it and made just like a single opening, and put a bunch of like police with like big guns like standing out in front, and sort of like a checkpoint area for people who go in and out of it. And I think that's like so interesting and cool looking, because it really like adds character. Like, why is this building being guarded like that? Like, what's inside of it? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's kind of cool like seeing a variety of things down here. And the other cool thing about that particular little space is I was able to do a cool thing with the pedestrian paths in order to kind of collect anyone who was coming out of the building, no matter where they were. And the only way to get from that pedestrian path to the main paths of the whole down below area would be through the guarded entrance. The other cool thing about these down below areas that I've just always had in my mind from day one of thinking about this concept was how I wanted this down below area to really feel like it was mixed in with the life support systems of this colony and the pipes and the electricity of the colony. Like it was really, there was a lot of pipes going through between buildings, a lot of wires, a lot of just like stuff like in the air between buildings. And this episode, I really spent a lot of time trying to figure out a good way to make that look good and a style for it all. So in terms of the pipes, I'm using a combination of different pipes. There's this awesome one called the Industrial Pipeline that's made by Batty Dia, which I actually can't really use very often in this city because it has these sort of supports sticking down. So if you try to raise it up into the air, it has these like weird things dangling from it, which doesn't really work. But the thing about this asset, which is great, is that it comes with all the props that make up the actual pipeline. It's like comes with like a dozen or 2 dozen different types of pipes and things. And so subscribing to this asset gives you like all these crazy little tiny props. And so I've been using a lot of these kind of like bronze pipes that comes with it and putting those across between buildings. And then there's also the Dole nuclear power plant pack, which is made by Ronix 69 and Jacaranda, I think is how you say it, that comes with all these sort of nuclear power plant things. But part of that is these really awesome large pipes that are function as like a useless building. Like it's a building that has no requirements or needs or anything. It just sits there. It's basically a prop. And so I've been using those a bunch too as pipes to go across the walkways and between the buildings. The other thing that I wanted to go between the buildings is a ton of wires and cables and things. So there are these great utility poles that are made by Takachi 269 on the workshop, and I use those a ton in order to make it look like there's a lot of like wires all over the place. Like I know there's some places where there's a lot of wires just like dangling in crazy ways from poles, like going in every direction. Pole has like 200 wires coming off of it, and I wanted to kind of, not everywhere, but just here and there, have places like that in these slums, but also just have a lot of wires going throughout. So I used a ton of these utility poles, and I also used a bunch of the modern light packs wire lights, and those are really awesome. I didn't know about them for a really long time. I used them for the first time in Kobayashi Island relatively recently, but the problem with these lights is that they require the network skins mod, and in this city I'm not using that because I don't need to replace any street lights or anything on roads, because it's not even close to what I'm doing here. So I'm not subscribed to that, and that causes an issue with the modern light pack where when you leave a game and load back in, the lights aren't on and you have to like do some weird stuff in order to get them to turn back on. And so what I did instead was I'm now subscribed to the modern lighting pack Liberated, which is by Eclectrics on the workshop, and as far as I can tell that doesn't have the same problem, so I'm using those instead, but they're basically the exact same thing. And they work great here because they fit right in with those utility poles. You can hide the poles that the light comes with, like inside the utility pole, so it looks like it's just a wire that's coming out of the utility pole, and those can stretch across the walkways and light up these lower areas because obviously there's no streets down below. And so until I personally place down lights in the city's going to be completely dark at night, and I want to be building a lot of this stuff at night in order to really remind myself constantly of where I need to be placing lights and how I want it to look at night. So this episode, we also put down our first public transportation in the city, and that's going to be the cable car. And the cable car is something that I've never once used in Cities Skylines. I can't even imagine more than a couple scenarios in a city why you would use a cable car at all. So this was foreign territory for me. I've never placed it down before. And so I had to do a little bit of experimenting, try and figure out how to use them, what even they are, how they work. The thing that's kind of a bummer about these, so I guess they come with 2 different types. There's like a middle section where they have a connection on two ends of the thing, and it's kind of a larger asset with like these hedges attached to them that are pretty ugly. And then there's like the end piece that only has one connection. That's where the line is supposed to turn around and go back the other direction. And that's a much nicer one. It's very small. So I placed that down and kind of hid it within some buildings, and it doesn't 100% match the look of the rest of this area at all. It's much nicer and more modern and has like curved sides to it, and it's lit up and it has glass, and it's not really the look I'm going for. So what I decided to do was try and hide it as best as I could. And I have these, you know, kind of like entrance and exit pieces that are part of the conveyor belt pack that I created, and I thought those could work pretty well as sort of like entrances and exits for the cable cars. They're a little bit too small. The vanilla cable cars that are just the default ones kind of clip through them when they're going in and out of it, but eventually I want to replace that with like my own custom cable car vehicle, so we could ignore it for now. But I basically use those and the side pieces that also come with that pack in order to kind of like make this sort of overhang piece of building with like some ploppable pavement on top of it that like covers up the cable car building there and like hides where the cable cars go into, and it makes it look a lot more like grungy and futuristic. So that's pretty cool. And then I also sort of had a problem with how the vanilla cable car pillars look, the ones that support the network of line, and they basically look like you're at a ski resort or something, and that's not really what I wanted. So I have this pack called the modular tower crane prop, and this thing is awesome. It's like 8 different props, and besides for the actual very top piece that's the crane itself, these can be so versatile. They look just like industrial trussing and like industrial platforms and concrete bases, and I think I'm going to be using these all over the place. I mean, I actually did already use the bases in the central exchange area when I had pillars going through the tops of some buildings, and so I used the trussing here in order to make sort of like a cage around the lower part of these cable car support pillars, and then put this kind of like platform piece like up towards the top of the pillar. And so I think that's going to be kind of like my go-to decoration for these cable car pillars that there's going to be a lot of them kind of going throughout this lower part of the city. So that's about it for this episode. Did some fun stuff this time around, setting up the style of this lower part of the city. Next episode, we're gonna continue working down here, setting up some new areas, a couple interesting things. And if you're interested in doing something like this or figuring out which assets I use, I have a link in the description of the video to the Steam Workshop collection that is literally every single asset that I have subscribed to when I'm working in this project. So feel free to go check that out. Also feel free to, if you like the video, give it a like, subscribe if you're new, or if you have been dilly-dallying about the subscribe button, and look forward to next episode. Some cool stuff happening. So I'll see you all next time on Mars.